Welcome to Fortress on a Hill. I'm Henry.
I'm Danny.
I'm Kagan.
We're three leftist veterans that aim to expose the reality of the U.S. military's multiple wars abroad and to illuminate the damage military service does to Americans.
American presidents throughout U.S. history have used American military and diplomatic power to force regime change of democratically elected governments around the world.
Most veterans come from families vested in prior service, and American generals choose their own, ensuring diversity of thought never interferes with American warmongering.
How can we stand by and do nothing while our military kills and destroys lives the world over, while telling Americans that all this death and destruction protects them from terrorists when nothing could be more false?
Fortress on a Hill aims to change that.
You good people, and listen to my song. I hope you'll pay attention. I will not detain you long.
All right. Hey, listeners, we are back again. One of the great things, or not great things, but silver linings of pandemic is that we've been pretty regular here on Fortress on a Hill. We've been doing great interviews, on a weekly basis. Many of you probably listen to Chris Hedges and Bob Scheer. We just had Rebecca Gordon, that episode will release probably by the time you hear this. And now we are just super lucky to have Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, the historian, just kind of long-time analyst and activist. And we're really excited for this. And we have so many more great interviews coming, and the quality of guests has just really gone through the roof. So thank you so much, Roxanne, for being here.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm a great fan of your podcast.
Well, just before I introduce you, I was going to say, when you indicated in our, back and forth scheduling emails that you were a Fortress on a Hill listener, I think we were all three of us, pretty stoked and flattered. We're all familiar with your work. I believe, Kagan, is that right, was midway through the Indigenous people's history when I told him you were joining us.
Okay.
I just started. It's so good.
And it really is. It really is excellent. And we're going to talk about that and some of your other work. So let me just do a quick bio for those who aren't fully familiar with you. Roxanne is a historian, first and foremost, author, memoirist, and a speaker who researches Western Hemisphere history and international human rights. She grew up in rural Oklahoma, the daughter of a tenant farmer and part Indian mother. She has been active in the international Indigenous movement for more than 4 decades. And she's known for her lifelong commitment to national and international social justice issues. After receiving her PhD in history at the University of California in Los Angeles, UCLA, she taught in the newly established Native American Studies program at Cal State University Hayward and helped found the departments of ethnic studies and women's studies. And that really was a key period when these sort of programs were first really getting their genesis. Her 1977 book, The Great Sioux Nation, was the fundamental document at the first International Conference on Indigenous Peoples of the Americas, held at the United Nations headquarters in Geneva. She is the author or editor of several other books, including Roots of Resistance, A History of Land Tenure in New Mexico. And her 2 most recent works are An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States and Loaded, A Disarming History of the Second Amendment, both of which, for equally, if differently disturbing reasons, feel particularly relevant to this peculiar and, tragic moment of ours. So while this short biographical summary hardly does her extensive work and fascinating life justice, I'm quite certain we're going to dig into much of that during this episode. So let me just say for now, thanks again for doing this, Roxanne, and it's a genuine honor to have you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Danny.
Well, as always, I'm known as the more loquacious of the hosts, so I'll start us off. And, we're going to go in a lot of directions and do our best to to make this more than a corona analysis like so much media and reporting is today. So, some of that reasonable, some probably distracting, but some listeners might best know you for your work on Native American history, what you call Indigenous history, especially you're doing so in sort of the people's history vein of Howard Zinn, who many listeners have probably heard of. So I'm quite sure you've been obliged to answer these sorts of questions a lot. But if you'll indulge me, to start, can you tell us a bit about your background, personal scholastic journey, and how you came to the vast and complex subject of Native American or Indigenous history?
Well, yeah, I came from it. My destiny, I think, was not determined by my childhood. I was not supposed to become who I became, I think, but maybe I was. But I grew up in, like you say, in central rural Oklahoma. My dad was a sharecropper and tenant farmer, and also drove a diesel truck, fueling the richer farmers, the wheat farmers, tanks for their tractors, and any other job he could get to support us. So I grew up very poor. It was a poor community as such. It wasn't that unusual. I measured wealth by people having an indoor bathroom, basically, which we didn't. So, and even electricity. So it was a pretty harsh background, but I did have a history I inherited. My father's father was a socialist. I really liked your article, Danny, your essay on Eugene Debs, because my grandfather was a Debster and socialist. Voted for Debs for 5 times. I never knew him. He died before I was born, but I heard endless stories from my father about him. My father was born in 1907, so he was very young during this period, but he had, I think his dad sort of invested in him, the stories, because he had them. And there was nothing in my schooling that would make me think that these stories were true. It didn't really matter to me. It was, the story of this wonderful man. And I don't know if it'll ring a bell, but he named my father Moyer, Haywood, Scarberry, Pettibone, Dunbar. Those are the names of the IWW founders who were on trial in August 1907 when my father was born. So asking my father, tell me again about the names, your name. So he would tell me the biographies of Bill Moyer, Big Bill Haywood, Scarberry, each of them. They were hard rock miners, they were good people, and they were socialists. And so I'm the only kid. I was the youngest. I was asthmatic, sickly a lot, home a lot from school. And I was just a perfect listening post for my father's stories. The 3 older brothers and sisters were not interested. It took me years to prove to them that these stories were true, documentation. So my father, obviously, he also joined the IWW. They were very strong. Oklahoma was very industrialized. And from the 1880s, oil was discovered. It was a big oil patch, commercial wheat farming, coal mining, lots of immigrant labor, and very wealthy bosses. It was like a little third world country with a dictatorship, and all the press was controlled. So that's the circumstances I grew up in. And my last year of high school, I left home and I moved to the city to work and go to trade school my last year to become a secretary. But in that trade school, they also had a printing. Printing was one of their, and they did a daily newspaper. And one of the one of the trades that you could actually choose was journalism. So I slipped out of secretarial into journalism, where all the cool people were, and I met gay people for the first time, or people who admitted they were gay, and really kind of rebels. And it was a wonderful experience. It was a very kind of scary place. You know, I went from 3 people in my class in this little hamlet, Piedmont, to 350 students in my class and 1,000 students in the school. And it was the days of juvenile delinquency, and there was actually heroin being pushed outside by, so it was kind of scary. And I was still a very devoted Baptist girl. So it was very interesting, but it got in my mind to go to University of Oklahoma and study journalism. And my dad told me that's not a place for our people. You need to go to a teacher's college. No, I've got to go to University of Oklahoma. So I lasted a year there. It really was, I was completely over my head. It was, fraternity, sorority, the Big Red, football team. I'd never seen a football game before. We didn't have enough boys for a football team school. And so I got married and married into a family of union carpenters, which was a great blessing. And they were also, my father-in-law was a real civil rights activist. He almost single-handedly integrated the carpenters union in Oklahoma. And this was like 1957, 58, 56. Well, it already happened when I met my husband-to-be, so at 54, 55. So we always had a lot of union people there, and I was learning about unions and that whole history. They were all kind of New Deal Democrats, and that was hard for me to reconcile because my dad really did not like the New Deal. He said it was to save the capitalists, and he was really right, but it was better than what we have now. But he had to work for the WPA. There were no farms and he was humiliated digging ditches. He said he was very humiliated doing that work. So I had a very different view of the New Deal than that rosy thing, that people tend to have. But I did really respect these people, and I learned a lot from them. And I also, my husband had friends who were Middle Eastern. He was an engineering student, so the petroleum engineering students, many of them were from the Middle East. So I met a Palestinian who told me about Palestine, like 10 years after the Nakba. And I met Syrians and other Middle Eastern students. So I became kind of internationalized in my scope. And so 3 years I did not, I worked and sent my husband to finish his degree, and then we were going to move to San Francisco and find the beatniks. So we did that in 1960. The beatniks had all dispersed, unfortunately, but it was, it was a whole new world in San Francisco State College. So that's really the kind of, piecework that brought me to be an activist. But I was very lucky. I don't know what would have happened had there not been a gigantic movement building, the civil rights movement. Could see on television all the time, these sit-ins in the South and the police, sheriffs beating up crowds of people. And then the student activism really started it wasn't all that active when I was at San Francisco State, but it was beginning to happen. And then I fell in love with history, one history course, and decided that was my major. And I had some good mentors. I tell people, younger people, it's really mystifying to a lot of younger people that from after grade school, I never had all of my teachers and professors up to a PhD were white males. And so that was, my mentors were all men at San Francisco State because there were no women professors. And so there were in some fields and, music and all, but certainly not in history. And so I got persuaded to go to UC Berkeley to be a graduate student. It hadn't been my plan really, but it was handed to me. Fortunately, the universities were all free at that time. So I went to Berkeley for a year, and it was very European oriented. The university system in California had been designed in the 1950s to specialize their different graduate schools. And so I decided I wanted to do Latin American history. I took a trip to Mexico, and I said I have to understand something. I got interested in imperialism, when I was an undergraduate. And it was very kind of staid European. It was interesting. I mean, I learned all about the Juncker class in Germany and brought that up to eventually to Nazism, and had German professors from Germany. It was, very, very rich, but it just wasn't what I was interested in pursuing. So I transferred to UCLA. I left my husband along the way. We married too young, and he became very much an engineer and really resented me, my pursuit. I was supposed to be a housewife. And so I went to UCLA and did Latin American history. I wanted to learn about imperialism. This is right after soon after the Cuban Revolution. And so everything was kind of centered on that. And it wasn't a very radical program, but it was so obvious just studying the history, that we had to talk about imperialism all the time, because that's what was going on, U.S. imperialism in Latin America. And so that then, 64 to 68 is where I really became active politically against the Vietnam War. We had a VA hospital right next door to UCLA. And actually, there's a lot of Ken Burns kind of lies about the anti-war movement. There was no spitting on returnees. There was none of that is true. And what we did was form actually a group of people to go, and it's really growth. The kinds of wounds, so many paraplegics or people with nothing but head and torso, and they would hang them out on like clotheslines, and to get some sun. So we would go talk with them and actually write letters to their relatives and all, and learn about what went on there from them. So I met a lot of returnees. It was the major hospital, I think, at that time for the horribly damaged people. So I think it really went deep in our group, which was very small. We started a vigil in 1965, and there were only 6 of us: me and my then partner, and another couple we knew, and the guy who organized it, a philosophy professor, a radical philosophy professor. And by 1967, that vigil had gone all the way down in, don't know UCLA probably, but Westwood and around the federal building and circle and came back up on campus. So just seeing that, that kind of, I think that's what's different about movements now. It's very hard to see success, and actually building a movement. So that's kind of my, I didn't finish my PhD. I revolted. I said, I don't want any more. We started losing some of our battles. And I got disgusted with everything and took off. And for 5 years was just a full-time militant, went underground for a while. And then did decide to go back and finish my dissertation. That's all I left. So I wrote my dissertation, then started teaching. So that's my. Then the Native American movement is what what really propelled me in 1970, 71 is when I had, should back up because I got interested in ethnic studies because a history professor was hired, Ron Chakaki. I don't know if you've ever heard of him, but he is basically the founder of ethnic studies. He's a Japanese Hawaiian working class guy. They were pineapple workers, his family. And so his family wasn't relocated because they didn't do that to the Hawaiian Japanese, but he's got his PhD in history at UC Berkeley, and he did African American history, the first course taught at UCLA in African American history in 1966. And I volunteered to be his teaching assistant, even though it was in US. By then I was a senior graduate student. I had passed my exams. All I had was a dissertation. So I had first choice of who I wanted to TA for. And I said, I want Ron. And so your prestige, the TA went along with the prestige of your professor. And he was only an assistant professor in his first year. I didn't care. I wanted to learn what he knew. So in the first class, about 500 students signed up for it. It was very popular. It was a very white campus at the time, but the front row was filled with these very militant-looking African-American men. And they came to check out. They heard about it, they came to check him out. And he passed. And then they asked if they could audit the class. So he did. He said, sure. And they were really enriched the class, bringing up things and all. Well, they fired Ron for that. So he went to Berkeley and started ethnic studies. But that was the that was a seed planted in me. And so I ended up, when I did, decide to go on the job market after I finished my dissertation, I took a job in Native American Studies. And I had already gotten involved somewhat, in the American Indian movement, and then got more deeply involved. And living in San Jose, the San Jose AIM was very active. And so this was right after Wounded Knee. And there were a lot of criminal cases, so I got involved in as an expert witness in some of the trials, and that's what led me. The Great Sioux Nation was a documentation of one of those hearings to dismiss all the charges based on the Sioux Treaty. There were about 300 misdemeanors and felonies, and so it covers a 2-week hearing, federal court hearing in Lincoln, Nebraska in 1974. So then I was really deeply involved, and out of that came the International Indian Treaty Council. AIM formed that International Indian Treaty Council. So that is the main work I have done that got me involved in all kinds of international human rights work, especially with Central American refugees in the 1980s, many of whom were indigenous peoples, the Mayans, especially about 200,000 Mayan refugees in Mexico and other parts of the world. So that international work really expanded what I was doing and thinking about and writing on, and I pretty much devoted myself to. Well, I wrote a book called Blood on the Border, Memoir of the Contrawar. So this was mainly opposing the Contrawar in Nicaragua. And so that was, we really lost very badly because the United States was adamant, to stop those Central American revolutions. And it's really sad. I think after a lot of successes in movements, that was a real, a wake-up call that this is the counter-revolution that we're in now.
Yeah, this is really, I love backstories. I guess maybe that's one of the reasons I got involved in history initially, was that sort of narrative side. Yeah, I'm really glad you brought up AIM, the American Indian Movement. I was actually going to ask before you brought it up if that was, just given the temporal kind of space, I was wondering if maybe that had an influence, and obviously it did. I grew up on Westerns. I was very much partially raised by my grandfather, great guy, New Deal Democrat, but, standard patriarchal sort of Wild West sense, so I grew up on John Wayne, and I was a weird little kid. So I remember one summer when I was maybe 8, I took every book, adult books, about Custer and the Little Bighorn out of the library in Staten Island, so that was kind of my initial intro. But then I got somehow, I think it was through watching actually sort of a fictional movie called Thunderheart with Val Kilmer. Wow. I think that's how I first got exposed to the American Indian Movement, Leonard Peltier, and read his book and just a bunch of stuff. So that was really eye-opening for me, because it was the first time, and I think I must have been in high school. So it was the first time I looked at things from sort of another angle. And in the old way of thinking that I had, Native Americans disappear in 1890, right? They sort of disappear with the closure of the frontier. If you're an academic, it's the Turner thesis. If you're a lay person, it's Wounded Knee or whatever. Same general timeline, but it was interesting. And I also thought it was fascinating the way you brought up Central America. And because I think so many times it's really seen as discrete. There's American Indians and then that's it, right? And there's no connections to Native Americans elsewhere. So I think it's fascinating that you've taken a look at Indigenous history cross-border, right? And it seems like you did that well before it was academic chic to talk about borderlands and transnational history.
Yeah, I think movements do that. They take you places that are far ahead of this, say, academic, what becomes more popularized. So it's a great gift to be in movements. Not many people have that opportunity now, which is something we did have, in my generation when I was young. Like I say, it became clear the reversals and losing all the time, that we have to figure out, how to have a buoyant movie, because it is the best way to get an education. Everything I know about, I never studied Native American cultures. I was not interested in anthropology. I was interested in imperialism and how it works. And everything I have learned about Native Americans and Indigenous peoples have been in the movements, not reading books. Well, there just weren't very many of them until Native scholars, really started being produced. And there were, when I got my dissertation in 1974, there were 3 Native Americans with PhDs. There were only 4 Native American doctors. There were about 10 Native American lawyers. That's just, it started from scratch. And so the Native American studies is really the most dynamic of the different ethnic studies. Some have become kind of boring and academic, but Native American studies has retained that edge, and it's still how Native students and allies get politicized in academia, because it is. We just had the 50th anniversary of the University of New Mexico Native American Studies. I directed that program for 3 years in the late 1970s. So I was asked to be the keynote at it, and all the past directors were there, and a lot of alumni, and then current students. And it just, just being reminded of that, and how it's more militant now than it was even then. And it was founded by the Kiva Club, the students set it up by threatening to burn down the campus. And that's how most of them were established in the first place. So we don't have that kind of permission, that we gave ourselves at that time to, to do things. We're talking on May 4th today, and of course this is the anniversary of the Kent State massacre of 4 students being killed by National Guard, protesting against the invasion of Cambodia. So I think that was a turning point. It really did work, even though it was an uprising. I was driving across the country. I was actually on a movement speaking tour, and campuses were on fire. There were tanks on campuses. The University of New Mexico had tanks, and it was just fires all over. Every ROTC building, I think, had been burnt during those demonstrations. And most of the universities closed for the semester, just closed, gave it over to National Guard. In some cases, Army. It was the Army at University of New Mexico. So just driving through these places, where we were supposed to speak and had been rearranged to speak off campus, it seemed successful, but I think it had the desired effect from the government of quelling, for new people coming in. That's a lot to ask of them. Okay, you're going to get killed. You have to worry about this. You're going to get killed. They think twice, about just jumping in. So that was really the marker, I think. And then, of course, a week later, same thing happened in an all-Black university college in Mississippi, Jackson State. They killed three students who were protesting the war. So it really did cool down things. And of course, the Reagan, the rise of Reagan in California it already had him for 8 years when he became president. And that was, his view was, I don't have a direct quote, but Santa Barbara, when he sent in the National Guard, he said, there may be a lot of dead bodies, but so be it.
It really is striking. And I'm going to ask you a little more about Reagan in Central America later. It's interesting that you mentioned how in the short run, it seemed that the protest movement had so much power, but maybe in the long run, the shootings at Kent State and the other repression and Jackson State, which is forgotten, had this quelling effect. I think that has really maintained itself. I'm here at the University of Kansas, which is in Lawrence. It's kind of this, For those who don't know, it's kind of this like liberal, or today, hipster oasis in Red, Kansas. And in 1970, after Kent State, this place was on fire too, right in the middle of Kansas. The National Guard was here. There was shootouts. There was shots fired. They shut the campus. There was a citywide curfew. And then when we conducted another illegal action similar to Cambodia, not as intense, of course, where we, assassinated Qasem Soleimani of Iran. I was keynoting a rally out downtown 4 blocks from the university, and we had 11 students, total. Right. And so, I think it is a shame. I think the draft has something to do with that, though not everything. And it's a tough thing. But, let me have one more follow-up before I turn it over to my co-host. On this Native American issue, and I want to ask you about teaching. As you may know, for a time I taught U.S. history to freshmen, or what we call plebes at West Point. Contrary to what a lot of folks out there might tend to think, and I've said this a few times on the pod, the military academy, for its legion of flaws, is a real university as much as it is an automaton, indoctrination center. For example, to give a little bit of West Point faculty inside baseball, the history and the English departments, for example, were considered and even pejoratively labeled hippies, by the staff from the other subject areas, and frankly, there really are sort of liberal active duty Army officers in the history department there, not as radical as maybe me, and certainly not as, definitely Army rather than real world liberal, but still a fairly remarkable thing. That said, I think it would genuinely shock some folks out there to know the sort of progressive and somewhat cutting edge, I was just out of grad school, so cutting edge historiographically speaking material that, I myself presented in the classroom. But all that aside, the syllabus, the day-by-day subject lesson plan, was still set in stone for the American History 101 course that I first taught, which is probably very similar to what's out there across the country. There were only 40 lessons, and we had to do, this might be different from other universities, we had to do all of American history in a single semester to teach the breadth of that history. So when you take into account day one sort of housekeeping and a couple of test dates, there were really only 35 or 36 teaching days. So as such, the course began essentially with Jamestown and ended with Obama's election in 2008. Consequently, 2 things resulted, I think. One, a vast temporal history of pre-1607 indigenous peoples and even early Spanish colonization was erased. And 2, though most of us made a genuine effort to include their voices and agency, Native Americans really only turn up in sort of cameo roles sprinkled, throughout certain, what we would say, quote, relevant lessons. So that's a long lead up to what I think are a couple of difficult questions for you. First, what precisely is lost in this teaching formula, which I think is still pretty vast and widespread? And 2, how would you recommend handling the subject of Indigenous agency and voices, from a pedagogical standpoint in these required courses, where it's a survey and there's limited space? How do we do it? What's the best approach?
Well, really good questions. Of course, the truth is lost, of course. That's really what is lost. And you're right. Even Howard Zinn's wonderful paradigm shifting book, which was published in 1980, is extraordinary. It's never been really accepted as too radical for most historians. But even Howard, and he was a friend of mine, and I often talk with him about it, that he gets to the 1890 or Turner, the Wounded Knee Massacre. And up until that time, it's very good, except during the Civil War, where Native Americans disappear, even though there was the Sand Creek Massacre, the Dakota mass execution, the Navajo forced relocation. Kit Carson made an army captain and half of them died in a desert concentration camp. That never is mentioned in any of the Civil War material that's taught. So he made that mistake too, but he was very, very good on the initial genocide, and kept that up. pretty much. Andrew Jackson, he focuses on, on removal. And then he gets to the plains, is very, very thorough. And after that, there's nothing, until the current, his last chapter, which he kept adding to, but the last chapter, which was the movements, Black Power, Red Power, Chicano Power, Women's Liberation, Civil Rights Movement, everything, the 60s and 70s and 80s. And so I would ask him, what happened to them? What happened to the Indians? Were they hibernating, or, what? It makes it seem like they were all died off and then they were resurrected, at Alcatraz. And he said, I don't know how to write that history. He said that very sincerely, and kept encouraging me to. So when, he had published his book with Beacon Press, and I got a call from Beacon Press in 2008, and this wonderful editor said she was doing a Revisioning American History series and wanted Native American history of the United States to be the first volume, and that Howard Zinn had suggested that I would be the person to write it. So I said, oh, well, sure, I'll write that. That's easy. And of course, it took me 6 years. It was very, very difficult to write, even for me, even though I knew it all. And well, to put it in 300 pages and, go back 50,000 years in history of Native people in the Western Hemisphere and great civilizations. And so it really was a lot of work, but I didn't have to do any research. I mean, everything is known. This is what is incredible. Everything is already known. There's no secret documents. There's no, it's purposeful to, because it's that inconvenient truth that the U.S. narrative, multiculturalism shifted it somewhat, but actually the elements of the narrative, of the founding narrative, founding fathers, and they're imperfect. Now it's what they call warts and all, no more polishing, and even though that's not really true, they still do that, deification of the founders. But teachers mostly have materials where they say this is flawed, there were flaws, but it's like, the Lincoln thing, the more perfect union has to be formed. There are these errors and mistakes, but not getting to fundamental questions like, what does effect of genocide have on the people who commit it and their progeny? And it's left out, completely. What does it do, to 20th century history between 1890 and 1960s, to not even deal with these almost abandoned reservations? And still today, Native American reservations lifespan is 47 years. It's just incredible. It's still the situation. And that there was a Termination Act in 1953 to terminate all Native Americans. And it's not in any lesson plans. Or what does that say about the United States? That right when, and one of their excuses for allotting Native land in the 1880s, the Dawes Act, Senator Dawes said, that greed is the basis of civilization, and these people living communally, they will never do well until they learn to be selfish and and have private property. And that was in 1880s. But they were saying the same thing with the Termination Act. It's communist. These people are living communally. And even on the left, there's this, it also doesn't fit the working class, the proletariat model of revolution. And so they ignore what settler colonialism is and what it does to the mentality that everyone wants to be a king and rich, and they certainly don't want to call themselves working class. They call themselves middle class and ask for aspiring. So all of these things being left out is just damaging every generation of children, I think. But I feel kind of hopeful. An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States came out, and a Young People's edition last July. And although our work on it, going around, educators and teachers and all, has been cut short with the stay at home, we've continued, a lot of it online, but it's very exciting. I persuaded a Native woman from Nembe Pueblo in New Mexico, Debbie Reese, to do the adaptation. I knew she was the perfect person. She does she has a project she's run for about 10 years now, maybe 15, of analyzing every children and young people's book that comes out for what is its, how does it deal with American Indians. It's called American Indians in Children's Literature. And she critiques it. She has become the go-to person for librarians and teachers for elementary and junior high and high school books, and for regular people who don't want to damage their children, but think it's and the Indian in the cupboard is a nice little story, for children. And so that I knew she was the perfect person to adapt it, and it's absolutely wonderful book, and it won every award. This is why I'm encouraged. It doesn't water down my thesis at all. Nothing in it is watered down. It's simply refashioned, with lots of things in blocks and summaries of things and questions asked. But everything is there, it's intact, and teachers are hungry for it. It's just, and parents, it really encourages me that the desire is there. And I was invited to the American Indian Museum in the Bowery in New York. Not the newer one in DC, and invited me. They had one in DC, but Debbie did that one, and I did the one in New York. Every year they bring teachers together, 3,000 teachers locally, from New England and New York area, New Jersey, to learn new curriculum, to have really a week-long intensive thing. So they brought me as a keynote speaker. I spoke to 3,000 educators, every young people down to K to 12 teachers, and some of them charter schools, some of them public schools. And I couldn't believe, the reception. For one thing, the book was, was required reading before they came, and how enthusiastic they were. So it's too bad that, universities, usually you think you get out of the, kind of prison of the usual patriotic stuff and all you have to go through in public schools. And then you get to university and there's all this critical thinking, and you can read Marx, and you find all kinds of new things. But no, not with even as hard as I worked at my little university, Cal State University, my whole career there. I don't feel like I ever got through to the history department, The only thing other departments would do is try to, because our courses were so popular, and there was a required course in cultural groups, a very general thing, and a lot of things outside of our ethnic studies qualified for that. But we always had the best, and it's still true, the best percentage of students taking the classes. And so they would sometimes try to kind of steal one of our classes, but then not bring a Native person in to teach it. They still only have one Native American teaching Native American studies there. So this is, it's a little different. Like I say, at University of New Mexico, they've made a much bigger impact because it's a very densely Native area. The Navajo Nation is the largest nation, and some students who go to higher education go to University of Arizona or Arizona State, but many come to University of New Mexico, and especially since Native American Studies has been established. So they have about 3,000 Native American students, and that's a really critical mass. They have a huge effect on the whole campus, but those are specific spots. I would say upstate New York, the Sunnis, the Haudenosaunee have been very good about imposing themselves without invitation to be a part of the curriculum, since it's their territory. And they are pretty powerful people. So I find people really conscious there, and you can't really avoid it. But most of the country, including Oklahoma, where I come from, which has, the second largest Native population, 50 different Native nations, that was the relocation, place in Indian Territory. So 50 different Native peoples from east of the Mississippi who were forced there, plus the Plains people who were already there at the Osage, Caddo, and the others relocated there, the Cheyenne and the Comanches. So it's difficult there. They actually do have a governor now who's Cherokee, and he's just horrible. He's a right-wing Republican. So universities, though, should really be shamed for not doing better in history. History, as you know, being, having gone through a PhD in history and teaching in history, are the most conservative. I was told at UCLA, one of the, taking Latin American history, one of my fields of study had to be Spain and Spanish imperialism. And I had one of the top, Stanley Payne, his name, one of the top scholars in Spanish history outside of Spain. He wrote mostly about the 20th century, but he was very knowledgeable about everything. I learned tons from him. But he told me in my first meeting with him, because he would be on my doctoral committee, that he did not think that women should be able to major in history or do a doctorate in history. So he just wanted me to know that. So, well, that's nice, okay. And he really, when he gave the reading list to me for my oral dissertation, he had 3,000 books on there. It's 3,000 books, most of them in French, Portuguese, and Spanish. And no way you could master it. He did everything he could, to get rid of me. And there were only 4 women in that department. We had 600 history graduate students at UCLA, 4 women. So it was, and one Chicano, 2 Chicanos, one African American at that time. So there is, a lot of integration of women's history and Black history into history field, but not Native American history. It just changes the whole narrative of U.S. history unless you really, really tinker with it in ways that, of course, is done. But I don't know how we're going to deal with it at the university level. As more and more Native Americans, the history field is very hostile to Native American. I think in my case, it's heinous because I was a woman, but graduate students at the University of Oklahoma have been, one was telling me why she dropped out, that she went in her first day after she was accepted, and she wanted to major in history, and in front of the whole group of new graduate students in history, the professor told her that you have to she's very obviously Native. She's Cherokee, but she's, very, very dark. She's a very traditional Cherokee family and spoke Cherokee fluently. You would think this would be a prize student, and he said, you have to know one thing is you can't be a historian and be an Indian. You have to choose which you're going to be. So that's not very welcoming for Native Americans to go into history. A few have, but they tend to go into one of the best known Native American historians is Jennifer Dent Valley, who's Dene Navajo, from a very traditional family, but she is brilliant and got her PhD at UNM, and then they really, really wanted her in the history department. But she felt so alienated there that she actually quit and went to Flagstaff to the state university there, which is, a majority Navajo students. And so she actually stepped down, within the first couple of years of her teaching career. And then she went to, she got recruited to Arizona State University, which had a pretty good, should be better, being right in the heart of Navajo Nation. But she was very alienated there too. So she got recruited back to UNM. History said they understood, why her alienation. They offered her more things. They really wanted a Native person. And she finally transferred to American Studies. So it's very hard to get Native Americans to scholars. They're in English, they're in more in anthropology that has improved, and in American Studies. But history is still, I don't know, what do you think is a problem with history? I see it as, having this European basis, this very Eurocentric basis as it's, in the historiography, and thinking that history is a classic field that's absolutely necessary, and that in practice it means with different nations that they are what I call the keepers of the secrets, rather than, because they know all this stuff. I know they know. They're not ignorant. They do know it. But it's not good for the, Arthur Schlesinger Jr. They all really think this, but he said it. U.S. history should be civics.
Right. That was the whole consensus historian shtick, for sure. So I'm going to shut up finally for a minute and turn things over to Kagan for a moment. And then, I think he's got a little bit more to ask you about some present Native American stuff, and we'll kind of go from there.
Great. Thank you, Danny.
The guys and I love doing the podcast. Being able to share our experiences in the military with allies and supporters means the world to us. But we can't do all the work. We need you to share an episode of ours with someone, anyone whom you might think could be affected by it. A young person looking to join the military, or possibly parents advocating for a kid joining the military, conscientious citizens who care about the violence the U.S. wages in their name, advocates for women and people of color who understand the harsh environment the military creates for minorities and inflicts on those same minorities across the globe, and anyone else you think might be affected by it. Please take a moment, share this with them. Now, our podcast is supported in a few different ways. First, there's Patreon, where we're blessed to have an array of wonderful supporters helping the guys and I pay for some of the podcast's expenses. Those who contribute $10 a month or more will be mentioned right here as an honorary producer of the podcast, helping keep you, our listeners, stocked with new episodes. But you don't have to contribute $10 a month to help us. For as little as $1 a month, you can help keep us going, paying for hosting and storage fees, transcribing old and new episodes, promoting and expanding the podcast, and more I'm sure I can't think of at the moment. So let's bring out these honorary producers, and they are Will Arens, Fahim Shirazi, Henry Zamota, Adam Bellows, Eric Phillips, Paul Appel, Julie Dupree, Thomas Benson, Emma P., Janet Hansen, Lawrence Taylor, and the Status Quo podcast. Your contributions are wonderfully helpful to us. Thank you so much. However, if Patreon isn't your style, you can contribute directly to us through PayPal at paypal.me/Fortress on a Hill. Or please check out our store on Spreadshirt.com for some great Fortress merch. And do understand that if you can't afford to contribute to us, that doesn't bother us at all. This is a hard time for everybody, and we just want to make sure that what we share gets to as many people as possible. And now, let's get back to the podcast.
So, just to kind of round out my question, my grandfather is Umatilla, and I didn't really know him that well, but I live in Portland now, so I'm a little closer to the reservation, and I work in social work, so I work with a lot of Native American people right now, with Native American veterans. And I grew up with, my family taught me a bunch of different folk stories from a bunch of different cultures. And so I grew up with this mindset of a story is a story and it's a good one. And, so why not learn about everything? And it was nice because my parents really encouraged me to learn a lot more about Native people's history in America. So while I was getting one side in school, I was learning another side on my own, and all about the various different tribes out there and what they're doing and what they have done. And just, it was really nice to get that other perspective other than that white European Eurocentric viewpoint that we only get in U.S. history. And I took a Native American cultures class my freshman year of college at this small liberal arts school in Illinois. And the first thing the teacher says is write down everything you know about Native Americans. And so I just go off and I start writing about the Eastern Woodland tribes and the Great Plains tribes and the Southwest, and just the stuff that I knew. And I looked over and I wondered, what other people were writing, because most people were done after 4 or 5 minutes. And we go through the class, and everyone is sharing their answers, and most people just said, all I know is the stereotypes. I know that they drink a lot and they own casinos. And I was just oh. And so at the end of the class, we all had to pick a tribe to talk about their history and, to now, everything that's they're facing now. And it was really cool to hear. This was more than just a freshman class. So there was sophomores, juniors, and seniors in my class. And I had kids who were juniors at the end of the class being like, I can't believe I've gone through school for 14 years and I'm just learning about this now. And I found that so like frustrating, but also like it was cool that like I'm glad that at least people are learning this in this class that's not very big, but at least like some people are taking the time to learn about it. So I just wanted to know, I've been reading about how Native Americans communities are trying to deal with the virus. But I just wanted to know if you could expand a little bit for our listeners what the response looks like. And also later on, I just wanted to talk about the federal response. But for now, can you talk about how certain communities are responding?
Well, of course, it's really troublesome because that first stimulus package, I heard the Dr. Burks actually say at the press conference that the first, it was like $2 billion was earmarked for Native American reservations and in urban areas. And that's how they're supposed to do things. That's really, through the treaties and all agreements and everything. And the Indian Health Service, I'm sure, had lobbied for that, and the Native, of course, the National Congress of American Indians. But to this day, that was in late March. To this day, there's zero federal money that has gone to any Native group anywhere. It's just, it's scandalous, but it's, so they've had to fend for themselves. And as you know, the reservations are purposely kept in conditions in which most people have to leave to go work and send money back. It's almost like little third world countries with remittances coming back. So half the population, mostly young people, live away, and not always in great conditions either. But that means the most vulnerable people are left with the reservation. The rates of diabetes is just skyrocketing because of the horrible kinds of food that is available in these places to the general population. I'm sure the white people in South Dakota also have a high diabetes problem. White flour, white sugar, fat, and white everything. And a lot of these are commodities from the government. Processed cheese and white flour, white rice, and of course, there is alcohol. We can talk about that. I see it as a the anthropologist Nancy Lurie, who is excellent. One of the few anthropologists who really got it. She saw Indian drinking as the longest protest demonstration in history, that it was a way of rebelling. And I've seen that myself, how quickly, alcoholism is a disease. It's addictive and it's not hard to. But an awful lot of Native Americans are not really alcoholics. They drink, but they're not alcoholics, and they can quit. I saw it with Wounded Knee. Suddenly, everyone down in the Tenderloin, all the Native people, they were up in the American Indian Center, which you couldn't enter if you were drinking or drunk. It's cold sober and packing blankets and all the same back to Wounded Knee. So, but nevertheless, a lot of alcohol is consumed, and cheap alcohol, and diabetes is just, and other diseases lower the lifespan of men to 47 and women to 52. They don't even live long enough to get Social Security. So it's so in these kinds of conditions and in crowded places, the the health centers and all are very ill-equipped. Some have maybe 6 beds or 12 beds and one ICU unit. They have to fly people out to hospitals, and anyone who's a vet, a native vet, will always choose Veterans Care over the Indian Health Service because it's much better funded, much better care. So the situation, especially in the Navajo Nation, is pretty grim. I try to keep up with it every day. Yesterday or over the weekend, a 28-year young woman, Navajo, who's Miss Navajo, and is totally healthy, she's athletic, and she died. She suddenly fell sick, and 6 hours later she died. And so that was a shock. She's from the Red House family, and who knows how many people live very communally. In a hogan, might be 12 people. 12 people live there, or if it's HUD housing, still, people live communally on extended families or extended family units being together all the time. It's very hard to have the social distancing and to just have the space to have social distancing. So the spread is just is really great. So there are a few other places that have been hard hit. The Pueblo Zia in New Mexico had the first cases of virus. One problem with the Pueblos is that the people are, tourists are so fascinated, local tourists and around the country and the world, because they're so traditional and still have their apartment stored, the oldest city-states in North America, and still practice their religion in kivas underground, and have many ceremonial days and feasts a year. So they have a constant tourism come in, and it's become a part of their income, for their welfare, and schools and their language programs and all. So they closed their gate, put up signs, no visitors, and people were still coming in. So that, I think, has been leveled off, but it's still a lot of people sick, and a lot of people had to be taken out to Albuquerque and to other hospitals away from their families, can't be seen. And I'm not sure about Oregon. I don't think it's been as hard hit, the reservations there. And Washington, they got a handle on things pretty quickly in Washington, and were hit early. So I don't think it got out so much to the reservations, although I think quite a few of the Native people in Seattle had the virus that I know of. So it's, this lack of any kind of federal funds. And of course, Donald Trump hates Native Americans because he thinks the casinos made his own casino go broke. He has to blame Indians or China or anything for anything he fails at. So they I guess, cannot really expect, and there's so little representation in Congress. There is, there are 3 Native people now, but the Democrats don't have much sway since none of them are in the Senate. And so there's really not a strong voice. The National Congress of American Indians, have really been on it, and they send out, I'm on the email list, and they give the tallies and keep warning I know that up across the border and that the Micmacs have been pretty hard hit. Of course, there was that mass shooting up there, 22 people killed. And quite a few of them were Native people, and they were just sitting ducks, being sequestered because of the virus.
So has the government given any response as to why there is no money or where it is? Because I'm sure people are asking, but it's just really frustrating that this has been in the news for a bit now, and people, like, there's still no response as to why they haven't given the money or what the holdup is.
No, it's just, but after, I don't know, 50 years of experiencing the federal government, and being observant of the federal government's behavior toward Native people, it's always an enigma. There was finally a lawsuit, that billions and billions of dollars that the federal government had cheated all the people who were on allotments. That were under trust, but so the government was supposed to be handling all those funds and were not. And the American Indian movement march on Washington in the fall of 1972. They took over the Bureau of Indian Affairs. At that time, nothing was computerized, but they took out, they were in there for 5 days. So they started reading everything, and then they boxed everything up and took it out. And that's actually what they went to present to the United Nations at the first meeting. They brought those boxes of materials. Just, incredible malfeasance and corruption in the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So it hasn't, it's been somewhat indigenized with the Red Power movement, but it's never been that. It got somewhat better in the 80s and the 90s. The Clinton administration was not bad. They were good friends, the Clintons, with Wilma Mankiller, who was the president of the Cherokee Nation, very prominent person. And but since 9/11, and where everything goes to so-called national security, and just the gutting of look at the CDC, it's useless now. It's just totally gutted. I knew that from doing the research on guns, where any funds looking into the health aspect of gun violence was cut from the CDC. And then I just started reading further, a couple of years ago, and everything was being gutted at CDC. So these, all of these, and then, just the billions and billions of that go to the defense budget has all the universities now. The only way they can get grants is through the Defense Department. So everything is getting militarized, and then they're not going to give any of that money away, apparently. So it's just, I guess, the pipeline to the reservations had been so cut off, and reservation, Native people have come to be more self-sufficient with the casinos. They've been able to build roads and schools and language programs, and but they can't, even with casino money and only the places that have a big tourist attraction, like in New Mexico or Southern California, or New England, really benefit that much to do some big projects, but they can't build whole health systems, and that's what the Indian Health Service is there for. That was an institution that was guaranteed by treaties that were made that in exchange for land cessions, they had certain social services that would be provided in perpetuity forever and ever. It would be a responsibility of the federal government. But it's so minimal that they do the best they can. I've met so many of those doctors and nurses working in those rather remote places under conditions, but with a crisis like this, they really are totally helpless.
So, if noting all the problems that you mentioned, I just wanted to ask, if you were a benevolent dictator, what steps would you take to kind of start to rectify some of these issues?
Well, the first thing is to transfer all of public lands, so-called public lands, lands held by federal government and states, back to their owners, whatever tribe they belonged to when they were taken illegally without treaty. That's why the federal government, there's all this pressure to from these Mormon ranchers and the guys with guns at Malheur and all. Why they don't respond to them and privatize. I mean, they lease, but they cannot sell federal land under their own laws because there's no treaty. They don't own it. They don't really own it. They just possess it. So they can't sell it. And it should be returned, including the national park. And this should be a main call for all social justice activists in the United States is return the land. And then to create a proper self-determination, a vote, just like the Samoa or Guam or Puerto Rico have the right to vote, whether they have independence or some state of autonomy and relationship or commonwealth. And those are the big things that have to be done for it ever to change and for Native people to be able to really to flourish as civilizations. And I think it's in the interest of all people in the United States that they be able to see how people who work collectively and here are people who own casinos, but they own them collectively. And they use that the casino money for public housing, for schools. It doesn't go into anyone's personal pocket. And I think there's one Native American millionaire, a guy who started he's a Chickasaw guy who started some roadside on Route 66, some place to stop and not Stuckey's, but something like that. I met him a few years ago. He's the only Native American millionaire. There's the cultures are so strong, and definitely shattered in many ways. But some of the elements of respecting the land and being a part of the animal world and plant world, being cognizant of that are things that people need to learn if we're going to save the planet. And so this native knowledge is being suppressed or squelched because of hardship. It hurts everyone. It's a resource that hurts everyone. So I know that's a big thing, but I think there's no patchwork that can be done that will change the situation of settler colonialism still existing, and colonialism and unadmitted to, still still existing right here. Not, and of course, Puerto Rico and Guam would also like to be self-determined and they're in much the same position um, as Native peoples. And so these colonies of the United States definitely need the decolonization is the only thing that will really change it. So I think this, in shorter term, I mean, with those is like the overarching, those are the demands of Native people, the fundamental demands of Native people. Now, what step by step, how do you get there? And this would take, mass movement. Native people can't do it by themselves. It would take, so that's one reason why the general education is so important. That once people learn this, you think, why would it be onerous for me to have to go to Grand Canyon and have it be completely controlled by the Havasupai, whose land it is, rather than the National Park Service? Why would that be a burden to me? Yeah, maybe during their ceremonies or something, they'll close the gates and say, no visitors, but they do that with the National Park Service too, like right now. So I think even, recently I've been interacting a lot with the National Park Service people. I noted that in 2014, someone told me they saw my book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States, in the National Park Service, those little stores they run. And I didn't believe it. It was at Land's End in San Francisco. I went out there and there it was. And I thought, that's interesting. And then it turned up in Sacramento in a National Park Service. So I then investigated, and the whole National Park Service was stocking that book in their bookstores. So I thought, well, that's interesting. So then I got invited to meet with some Park Service people, the ones who do Alcatraz and had the 50th anniversary last November, and the Presidio, and the ones around here. And it was just before we had to go in lockdown. We had this meeting down at the Presidio, and these young people, a couple of them Native Americans themselves, there are about 40 of them, they are all for transferring. They know, they actually know just from their work that these are Native American sacred sites that they are running themselves, and they want it to be restored. So that was an interesting new thing that I simply was not aware of. How the younger people who've been recruited to the National Park Service, sort of like the military right now. It's like, wow, they had different ideas than in the past. So I know that sounds big, but we got to think big because the small things are not working.
Hi, Roxanne. It's Henry. My turn
Henry.
to shoot to give you some questions here. So I'd like to start by reading a quote of yours discussing American gun ownership and its connections to America's history of settler colonialism. Quote, "The violent appropriation of native land by white settlers was seen as an individual right in the Second Amendment. That long intergenerational violent struggle to take the land is why descendants of those mostly Anglo and Scots-Irish settlers today believe they are the authentic lords of the United States and should govern, a kind of blood right. A firearm slung over your shoulder or a 9mm Browning tucked under your belt creates a sense of amplified power without which you feel naked and vulnerable. Guns are awesome. They are also beautiful objects that are addictive." So something we deal with here on the podcast is not just the military's appetite for hardware, for weaponry, but the civilian gun culture and how absolutely ingrained it is right now at this point in our history. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about your own experience with firearms and elaborate on the history of firearms as it pertains to the U.S., specifically concerning white supremacy and settler colonialism.
Yeah. Well, my own experience growing up, there were guns everywhere. They were certainly not the, well, there were a few at that time, military style veterans to bring home, but they were mainly rifles, 22 rifles, deer guns, and shotguns. Very few sidearms. I remember many people didn't have, expensive objects. People didn't have money for these things. But hunting, which I kind of, before I wrote Loaded, and did a lot of research on hunting, I was kind of already onto it, and Indigenous people's history of the United States, that hunting in the United States is it's not just about hunting. It's about becoming native, and making that transfer, replacing, like in the Last of the Mohicans, where the Indian hands over America to the white guy because, well, we're dead and gone, you have it now. And that makes them the real Native Americans. And so because they mythify Native people as hunters, which isn't really true, 90% of Native people in the whole Western Hemisphere were farmers and fishermen, not hunters. And they mythify then their own, Daniel Boone. I grew up with hearing about Daniel Boone. My mother claimed have some, they came from Kentucky originally, have some lineage. But then I found out that almost all Scots Irish, and he was Welsh, but that those colonial settlers on the land that kept moving. He died in Missouri, kept moving Kentucky to Missouri. That was the trek of both sides of my family. And my father's side is definitely Scots Irish, Dunbar. My dad used to say, but we were the bad kind of Irish. We were the Black Irish. And I said, what does that mean? And he said, well, we were the, we didn't like the Irish Catholics. So he had been taught by his father that it's not a great thing to be proud of, to be Irish. But that, that colonization of Ireland by Puritan, by the Calvinist Protestants is still still a hot spot today, and not settled a colonial situation. So those are the people who were the main settlers who were fighting for land, but basically in the colonies, settlers could take the land, drive the native people out, and redcoats didn't have to be called in, or even the Virginia militia, or whatever colonial militia. It was just taken, and then it would be ratified as a part of the colony, and that's how they got to the Appalachians, and then they stopped, and they had to make a revolution to keep going because the British put a stop to it with the proclamation of 1763. But the Daniel Boone idea of him is that he was a fur trapper. He was a failed businessman. He never really made it, but he kept trying, and he was kind of typical of these families. They kept moving. They kept losing their land. They would take it. They would do the killing. They would do the keeping the native people out, and then some big planter would come and push them out, or they couldn't compete because they didn't have cash in order to buy enslaved Africans and compete. They couldn't compete with the plantations. So they either had to just raise food to help feed, for them to buy, just be dependent. The whole thing was plantation agriculture all the way up, even to New York. So the idea of going, the Daniel Boone going into Kentucky, and he was a fur trader. They were killing all the beaver, but they didn't shoot them. They trapped them. They laid traps, and then they would come back. So the whole idea, it was a business enterprise. The deer skins as well. That's how buck for $1 in western Pennsylvania. They call deer skins were buck skins, and that's how the dollar became a buck, because that was the currency. So it was all commercial. It was just not. There wasn't this peasantry living off the land. It was completely commercial. So under the colonies, it had to be, because they had to send money back to the corporations that owned the colonies and to the crown. But when it was independent, also it was all commercial. So so anyway, this hunter, my brother's hunting, and all the men in the area hunting, I thought we did eat the meat. My mother hated it. She would not even touch the wild meat. She was smart, I think, not to. So what can happen? But my dad would eat squirrel and possum and rabbits, but we didn't have to, because we had chickens and we had some pigs. We didn't really have to eat the wild meat. But I think my dad was infused, with this idea. He had been a cowboy, actually a working cowboy on the 101 Ranch in Oklahoma, the biggest commercial ranch on the Osage Nation. And I think he, because he quit school and he became a cowboy, and he always wore a cowboy hat and boots. And so even though he was poor and a sharecropper and all, he could have this mythical image of himself. And so he always took a rifle or shotgun or both with him anywhere he went. Something to shoot. And it was a big trauma in my house. Most of the women also shot. They usually did target shooting. They didn't go hunting so much. Some of them did. But women also, like to be good with guns. And my mother was the opposite. She was an orphan. She has had a very tough childhood that I never, she was in foster homes. She was in a juvenile facility that she could get out on weekends, and that's how she met my father. But she really hated guns. She was terrified of guns, and there were always arguments about guns. As my brothers got older, especially my oldest brother, he was 15 when I was 4, was very volatile and very gun crazy, and he didn't care to hunt. Basically, it was just target shooting, and he went into the military after that, and was always into guns. But it was a big fight all the time, and so I think a kind of deal was made between my mother and father that she got the girls and he got the boys. That my sister and I, were not to have anything to do with the guns. She also didn't like horses. She didn't like anything about any of that. My dad always had. He actually raced quarter horses, and she didn't like dogs, and he liked dogs, hunting dogs, and so there was always this split. But I pretty much took guns for granted completely, and when I left, the family I married into, they didn't have guns at all. You know, they were urban people and they were union people, and I don't remember, but it could be they did, and I just didn't even notice it, you know, because I was so used to guns being everywhere. But then when I got, when we were, what led to us going underground as a political group was the repression, the New Orleans police, the FBI. After some of us went to Cuba and came back, and the FBI put out things that we were trained there, which wasn't true, and then come back. So there were hundreds of people who went to Cuba on these work brigades, and no one was trained in arms or anything. But this did, bring an excuse for either trying to discredit us or even kill us or put us in prison. So our answer to it was, to start getting guns to protect ourselves. We even had the Ku Klux Klan calling and threatening, to firebomb the place and all. So, and there were also Cuban exiles who had terrorist groups at the time.
So you've lived the full spectrum of owning guns, from starting off as a kid, going out shooting in the woods, later on seeing how cheap and abundant they are, being able to stockpile them easily, and having people misinterpret why you own them and what you might use them for.
Yeah, I think it did do some good to protect us. They were so, well, for one thing, Louisiana had no gun laws at all. The only federal laws were interstate commerce. There was no limit on how many guns you could have or how much ammunition of any kind. There was nothing on the books whatsoever. So it was so easy and that's how most of the states, Louisiana, I think, was probably the most gun-friendly state at that time. That's not why we moved there, but it became a reason for staying and going underground there. But what was interesting to me after a while, after a couple of years, is that we had become, the guns tend to bring attention to themselves all the time. You have, as you know, you have to take care of them. You have to oil them. That's what I remember from my childhood, is my dad and my older brother oiling and cleaning, and every day, cleaning the guns, get the guns out and clean them, and the smell of the oil and it became more about the guns, and also putting them in safe places. We even started reloading shotgun shells, but we got the gunpowder and actually a reloading machine. So yeah, but I then I didn't really figure all that out until later. Actually, when I was asked to write the book on the Second Amendment, I did understand what the Second Amendment was about, but I hadn't thought I would tell that story of that chapter I call Gun Love. But I do think the guns can be addictive at least in our society, where individuality is so strong and demanded of people, and every man for himself, and hoard goods so you can take care of yourself, that the gun becomes then a necessary part of that for a sense of empowerment, and then it becomes kind of addictive. It's just Only 30% of the US population owns even one gun, which is really interesting because, most people in cities don't really own guns unless they're in a gang or something. And that 30%, if you break it down, 67% of them are white men. And also 40% are veterans. And so you kind of, have to look at it as not a general, I think a general social problem or issue or fact, but this 30%, who are these 30%? And this is something I really got interested in exploring what, this part of it comes from, the early 20th century and onward, cowboys and Indians movies and gunslinging. And then I have a chapter on the Confederate guerrillas, which is really interesting because I grew up with, my heroes were Jesse James, the James brothers, the younger brothers, these gangsters, these outlaws, and Belle Starr, because she was a woman. They were all Confederate guerrillas. They were all my childhood heroes were Confederate guerrillas. And here I was. I didn't even know that until I was 15 years old. And I was very anti-racist already, and civil rights. And I didn't even know that Jesse James had been, but he got transformed by Hollywood, into just completely erased the backstory, so that he was just, the way that they shot up anti-slavery people in Kansas was riding fast on horses with a 6-gun, shooting into homes and shooting people, and that became the kind of signature of the cowboy and Indian movie, is riding fast on a horse with firing a pistol, a sidearm rather than a rifle. The Indians always had rifles. So I think it's, personally, I just didn't really I was really against gun laws because I don't think prohibition necessarily works, and I still don't think it works. I mean, nothing ever happens, for one thing. That shooter in Las Vegas they think they found all his guns now. I think there is up to 60 weapons he had, high-powered weapons, and not one of them was illegal. They were all legally bought. But he probably, and he bought them in several states, including California. But would prohibition do anything? And I still, I taught gun rights, gun control people come to my talks about the book, and they always think that I will be on the side of gun control, and of course the NRA, but as I see it, it's really not about money. NRA money. They have $30 million a year is their budget. That's just nothing for lobbying. They basically just monitor every elected office in the country. It's much easier now electronically, and they put out, there are NRA clubs in every nook and corner of this country. It's a grassroots thing, and no prohibition is going to change that. It's not probably the full 30%. Many of those people own one gun. The average is 9 guns per person. So that's hoarding, definitely. If you think you need a shotgun for self-defense, you don't need 9 of anything. So it is, it's deep in the culture, but it's deep in that culture that we now see every day, unfortunately, of that Trump has given permission to. He, of course, is just, exploiting it. He's completely the opposite. I don't think he even likes guns. His stupid son is a, trophy hunter, so exotic and endangered animals. But he's, he has said that he's not interested in guns himself. So it's just, for him, it's just his little army, which he has. So I think the militarization has increased the attraction to guns, the increased militarization, because it's always, I think we don't consider enough how deeply the military culture goes back to the very beginning of the colonies, and how settler colonial, how it worked, where the settler colonists armed. There's a really good description of from the early 1800s. Let me read that. It's really short. It's a man named Joseph Doddridge. He's a minister, an early settler in the Ohio country, so right after independence. He writes he went to be a minister there, so it wasn't, he wasn't familiar with this culture. But he says these early settlers on the frontiers of this country were like Arabs of the desert of Africa in at least two respects. Every man was a soldier, and from early in the spring till late in the fall was almost continually in arms. Their work was often carried on by parties, each one of whom had his rifle and everything else belonging to his war dress. These were deposited in some central place in the field. A sentinel was stationed on the outside of the fence, so that on the least alarm the whole company repaired to their arms and were ready for combat in a moment. But of course, what were they surrounded by? They were surrounded by native people whose land they had just taken, and were trying to get it back or not expand farther. So you take that and you multiply it by 300 years, moving across the continent in this way. That is a very deep militaristic culture. So I think that's why people, 70% of the population, when they're questioned and polls, say that they're for gun control. But that same 70%, or maybe it's not the same 70%, but it's 70% say that they think the Second Amendment should be respected. Of course, what I have to say about the Second Amendment is it should be abolished because of its racist content. That it is it was put in the Constitution by the, really because there was no way to take the continent, which they already had maps saying that's what they wanted to do. The founders, that's what they had planned, was to get to the Pacific Ocean and also take Mexico. And they had maps in the Northwest Ordinance, the Continental Congress, that's what their plan was. There's no way they could build enough armies to take all that land from pretty densely populated up to the Mississippi River with native people, and then beyond that, Mexican people. There was just no way they could possibly do it. So they had to, they made that choice. The British made it in establishing the colonies, of that variety of colonialism that's rare, of settler colonialism. But it exists in Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, those other Anglo colonies. The Spanish saw it as so successful, they implemented it in Argentina and Chile. but it's genocidal. They have to get that land. They have to wipe out or remove the people already living there, and so that's the armed citizenry has to exist to do that, and armies couldn't really. They never figured out how to fight with Native people's guerrilla warfare. They used counterinsurgency, simply wiping out villages, burning their foodstuffs. That's the only, and so that also developed into the army's culture. It was no surprise, that counterinsurgency book was updated during the Iraq occupation. So the militarism is very deep, and having located it in myself as a just an example of this kind of unconscious militarism. Not something obvious, although many of my generation did start going around in army fatigues and all kind of civilian militarization. So I think most of the veterans who come back from U.S. wars are the least likely people to be in love with militarism. That's why it's really important what you all are doing and organizing veterans, because they've seen the results of it. And if they do gain a consciousness of it, can really be a powerful force.
Well, it's it really is interesting how, as we always talk about, empire comes home, but also how culture and history within institutions like the military have this both Native American and then also rugged frontiersman facet to it. I was in the cavalry, which is really just another word for, motorized or foot reconnaissance. But, all of our history, like almost all of our mythology, centers around the Indian Wars, more so even than the Civil War. I mean, we wear the old Stetson hats. I mean, a lot of people don't realize that all the helicopters in the U.S. Army are named after a variety of Native American tribes. But even just sort of the language employed by military officers and politicians, right, in Vietnam and again in Iraq, Indian country, hostile territory, all this language, and then of course the gun ownership really just plays into it. This notion of rugged individualism, a civilizing mission. You've been so generous with your time, but I'm going to close out with one final question that's appropriate to my dorky nature. But one of the places where we've seen gun culture, or at least the use of an armed populace, right, the infusion of weapons, just really take a society apart with a lot of foreign backing, was in Central America. And so as I regularly joke on the pod, I like to do a fair amount of cyber stalking of our guests prior to their appearances, although I promise it's nothing nefarious. But what interests me is sort of scholars and public officials' past activism. We've talked a lot about that already with you. The subjects or issues that catalyzed them decades before we got to chat, because I think that's the foundation. And of course, if I happen to find something that links to my own side interest, more's the better. But, as you mentioned, in the 1980s, you traveled to, monitored, we're just an observer of the Nicaraguan Civil War in Central America. You mentioned Reagan earlier, and this topic to me was the crucial region and the most obscene axis of the sort of now canonized, Saint Ronald Reagan's foreign policy. It was certainly the bloodiest. So for most Americans who know anything at all about the U.S. role in Nicaragua, to say nothing of, El Salvador or Guatemala, their knowledge likely stops at the vague term or phrase Iran-Contra, a sort of poorly understood political, cultural touchstone that it's become. Yet the CIA backing, training, and arming of the Contras in Nicaragua, and support for the literal priest and nun murdering Salvadoran right-wing regime resulted in tens, if not hundreds of thousands of deaths. So, some might shrug all that off as either necessary to defeat communism, if some people still think that way, or dismiss it as an, at best mildly interesting long past history for dorks like me. But I, of course, reject that. And so as we see, at least in the post-second term Obama era, it seems that the shift of U.S. military activity worldwide, including in Latin America itself, has gone from conventional troop occupations that we saw in the George W. Bush administration to more like bombing, spec ops raids, and most importantly, dishing the dirty work to local regional proxies. So with all that being said, I want to know how you think finally about your 1980 Central American experience today, specifically, your key takeaways from that work, and then what is its relevance? And, feel free to tell me if I'm stretching or playing crazy, but what is its relevance for today and America's foreign policy future moving forward?
Yeah, well, we see at the border, the results of those wars with the refugees. Almost all of them now are from Central America, and their children in cages all around the country. So these revolutions, of course, you probably know that the United States has been meddling in Central America ever since the Central American Republic as such became independent in 1830. It became independent as a federation of the whole isthmus, from Costa Rica to into Mexico, took the big hunk of Guatemala later. But it was a unitary federation, and it only lasted 23 years because both the British and the United States, what imperialism, what U.S. and British imperialism especially are good at and focus on is segmenting peoples. I think the whole Southeast Asian, war was to make sure that there wasn't a federation, and they succeeded in that, if nothing else, by killing millions of people. So Central America, they broke it down, but it's always had this, and then they each became separate banana republics, competing with each other for the U.S. and world market. And the same with the Caribbean, they did that also with CARICOM in the 20th century, breaking it down into the Caribbean nations, each with their tropical fruits and aluminum, bauxite, competing against each other. So that's how, imperialism really works, to keep, not allow any kind of sprouting up of a powerful subregion of the world that might be influential. So clearly Central America was, never left alone by the United States. They occupied Nicaragua 3 different times. And this was always the Marine Corps invading, occupying, especially northeastern Nicaragua, and meddling in the affairs of all of the Central American countries. So that, when they came up to the Kennedy administration, supposedly a reforming relations with Latin America, they offered the, the aid for development aid. And they all took it, except, it had its strings and all, but El Salvador didn't take it. They, so what the Kennedy administration did was say, well, okay, then if you don't do something development, you're going to need a lot of military aid. So they gave them, armed the dictatorship. And, in most places they did both, because if the poverty continues, there's going to be a revolution. You've got to create the middle sectors, the middle, that's all we did in Latin American history, and we're the middle sectors, prevent a revolution. So they meddling, there were attempts at revolution, of course, in Guatemala, which is the largest country and the most populous in Central America. They had peaceful transition from dictatorship to a democratically elected president, who was then followed by another democratically elected president. And the United States fomented a coup to overthrow that democracy. And of course, it's been one horrible military dictator after another. And in Nicaragua, they never even got close to that kind of democratic situation. After the Sandino, the first Sandinistas, the Sandino fight against the Marines, the United States, and drove them out, actually. You went into, to actually create an autonomous zone of northeastern Nicaragua that would be socialist, and of course he was assassinated, and the Somoza family then took over. So in each one of these cases, in El Salvador, they simply massacred all of. They thought, all the native people, except those who hid out and changed their clothing and didn't speak their language anymore, the Nawa people, Sonsonate. And they were the base of Farabundo Marti's guerrilla army, completely suppressed and wiped out. So in the 50s, after Guatemala, it looked, really bleak. But in Nicaragua, and in Guatemala, another resistance movement under Tercio Lima rose. He was a lower rank army officer who was really within the military. He took a bunch of military people with him. So it was a very militaristic fight. But again, the U.S. intervened and put it out. So the one that started really having some possibilities was the FSLN, the Sandinista Front, and it started in the 50s. Really, it began in the 50s and started building, and slowly, they built up university students and into the it's very hard under a dictatorship. Many of them were imprisoned for the entire time of the Sandinista fight, like Tomas Borge was in prison, and Daniel Ortega was in prison. So they were able to Carter was very he had a perception of how they wouldn't be able to govern. So why not pull out the dictator? Everyone in the world hated him by then, the Somoza, such a foul person, and, all the deaths. They had like 56,000 people out of 1.5 million people killed. But the Sandinistas actually, I can attest to the fact that they didn't know how to govern, but they were learning, they were learning as they did it. And they were very sincere. They brought in every international institution. So for those of us who know the, international things, that they can't go to any country unless they're invited. And so they invited everyone in, the WHO, the UNESCO with their language programs, the refugees, the UNHCR, and Nicaragua started taking a lot of refugees. They had a lot of Guatemalan Mayan refugees and also Salvadoran refugees. And so they had this internationalist scope anyway, and this of course gave great courage to the FMLN in El Salvador and the different. There were 5 different guerrilla groups in Guatemala that then formed a unitary political front. So yeah, so I went down first in 1981 because there were disturbances out in that northeastern zone, where Sandino had worked. This was the Mosquitia, the Mosquito Indians. And we had met them, in international. They came under Somoza, so the Moravian missionaries. Somoza kind of just turned that area over to the Moravian missionaries and the other American missionaries. And so they weren't really bothered that much by the Somoza regime, although they were poor and, dependent on missionaries and malnutrition and horrible conditions of life. But they had some, the Moravians actually sent some to universities. So there were, a class of educated, some doctors and lawyers. So they came to our first international meeting in '77. We were a little suspicious because of Somoza, and they had their own organization, Alpomiso. But after the Sandinistas came in, they really didn't know. The ones in the United States did. There was a very large Nicaraguan population. Half the population practically of Nicaragua lived in San Francisco, in the Mission District. They were, they had come for jobs, and the United States didn't even require papers from Nicaraguans. There were a lot of skilled workers, so it was a way of getting rid of any militancy. Young people said, well, we'll go to the United States and work, or go into the U.S. Army, and then get the GIA Bill. So we had San Francisco was Sandinista North America Center all during, the guerrilla fight in the 70s. And then afterwards, most of them went back to work and some of them went and fought also in the Southern Front. And so I had a deep interest. I knew them, they were friends, and a lot of them born in the United States and spoke perfect English. So, there was a easy affinity with solidarity from the United States that formed very quickly and then spilled over into the other parts of Central America. But this disturbing incident out on the Caribbean coast, which they call the Atlantic coast, a group had formed around a leader who, were anti-communists. They were Moravian raised, American evangelical, very anti-communist. And so when the Sandinistas came in and started trying to, form collectives and do some of the things they had done in the East, they were a little clumsy about it because they didn't know the culture well, and probably trusting the Moravians too much, more than they should have, put things in their hands. And they were, disrupting everything that the Sandinistas did. That was very obvious to me right away. But I got invited down to by some friends who were formerly been in San Francisco and had gotten very involved in the American Indian movement. That's how we knew most of them. They were very involved. And Carlos Fonseca from the mountains, had sent a letter to Wounded Knee, expressing solidarity with the Wounded Knee 1973. So there was really a close affinity with the American Indian movement. So I went down first to check it out and see what I could ascertain, I didn't know, the mosquito culture that well or the area. I've never been to Central America, but just to, get a sense of it. But what I did know really well were evangelicals, because I was raised a Baptist. I really know their tricks very well, so it wasn't hard to figure out what they were trying to do. And because I was from the U.S., they told me a lot of things, because they thought I was on their side. And I just listened and took notes and, yeah, well, and they were working already with the U.S. State Department. Of course, this was the Reagan State Department, and they made a huge deal out of fighting communism in Nicaragua, and it was pretty amazing. What we were up against, fighting that propaganda that was coming out. They actually formed a publicity department devoted. Pat Buchanan was in charge of it, devoted to propaganda against the Sandinistas. It was just, and they focused on the mosquitoes and claimed that the Sandinistas had killed tens of thousands. There were only 70,000 mosquito people population total in Nicaragua. And Jean Kirkpatrick announced on, she was UN ambassador in the United Nations, that the Sandinistas had killed 200,000 mosquito Indians. And there weren't even that many. And I wouldn't check. I kept going down there to check out things because I didn't know what was true and what was not true for sure. But I would go down and I would actually meet the people who supposedly had been killed. They often were across the border in Honduran refugee camps, and so it was really to see that up close, and also to be in a war zone with U.S. Warships off the coast. You could see them, in the Caribbean. And there are warplanes buzzing the place. It was the first time I had ever been under attack by the United States, to see a little bit what it feels like. And it's terrifying, so it was really, really an impossible task to, the U.S. really wants something and wants to really devote itself to destroying a country of 2,000 people. You can't keep them from doing it, and that's the, really sad thing. And to see now, what's interesting is the Sandinistas came back in power during the George W. Bush administration, when the U.S. wasn't looking very closely what was going on. And they're not exactly like the old FSON, they cannot be, but they built some institutions. One is the land reform and the collectives that still exist. They developed Via Campesina, which is an international peasantry organization that's in every third world country now, and it's still based in Nicaragua. So when the first unaccompanied children came from Central America in 2011, 12, it was under Obama, second term. I don't know if you remember it, but it was a huge, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of unaccompanied children from Central America. Not one of them was from Nicaragua, not one. And in this last, in the last 2 years, the caravans and all, not one single Nicaraguan refugee, because they've been what they did was, they didn't create socialism, but they did almost totally destroy income inequality. So kind of everyone is, more or less poor. Some are poorer than others, but they have food sovereignty, total food sovereignty in Nicaragua, and no gangs, until 2 years ago when the U.S. unleashed the Salvadoran gangs to go down and tried to overthrow. They were not successful. They caused a lot of damage, but it really shows that Nicaragua is now listed with Venezuela and Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela as the troika of tyranny by, what's his name?
Oh, by Bolton, of course, yes.
Yeah, Bolton.
Well, it's so much what you said is fascinating. Two big points. Well, first of all, the Bolton Troika thing. I love the enemy idioms that we peddle in so much. In fact, it's fun though, because sometimes as a historian, you get to see like a very much a Back to the Future sort of effect. Whereas, Reagan included Nicaragua in his terrorist Murder Inc. group of 5.
Right.
Which no one remembers that he used mafia language. You think that Trump would have taken that on. But, it's really incredible, as is what you said, which is if the United States wants something, even though it tends to lose its bigger wars since Second World War, if it wants something, it can achieve it with enormous firepower. And yet one is left hoping or wishing that we would use that power for greater ends or more ethical ends. And it just, of course, has generally not been the case. And a laboratory for that, as you've noted, has been Central America, which is our backyard, as we like to say, as our admirals repeatedly say, who command as imperial proconsuls Southcom. So this is really just all, I think, incredibly relevant. I think that America, the empire doesn't go away. It just morphs. It changes clothes. And so, getting bogged down in Iraq or Afghanistan, that's out of style for a while at least. And so I think we'll see a lot more of this proxy warfare, which stays under the radar, but is often bloodier, or at least as bloody. And again, for a laboratory, it's hard to find a place better than Nicaragua or El Salvador or Guatemala, to say nothing of the Arab world. So this is really great stuff. Well, Roxanne, we've kept you for quite a while, and I'm so thankful for your time. I mean, I know people are busy and struggling in all kinds of different ways. I will say, I think that we did a pretty good job of making the episode not all about Corona, although we hit some inflection points that are necessary. So as we wrap up, is there anything you're working on now, or someplace that you would point or direct our listeners to catch your existing work?
Well, I am working on a book, so, the isolation is not too bad for me because the book was overdue. It is about the border, the Central American refugees and the wars, and in general about this whole idea that the United States is a nation of immigrants. So I am working on that, and it's much on my mind. But another thing I've been really thinking about, I met a Iraq vet against the war, a representative up in when I was in Washington State. It was about 4 years ago, and he put an idea in my mind I had never thought of before about how we should start thinking about how the military could be transformed, the U.S. military, because it's very hard to think of getting rid of it completely or just reducing the budget. Even if it were half of what it is now, it could still destroy almost any country in the world or the whole world. And he was talking about, repurposing the military for the time ahead where we're going to be suffering, climate catastrophe. And already there are, huge numbers of refugees everywhere. I just read in today's paper there are 3 million Afghan refugees in Iran. And so there are Afghan refugees all over the world. There are refugees everywhere. And and it's only beginning, the climate refugees that are going to come. So I hope you all are thinking about that too. I don't know how widespread it is, and that little group there, that small group of Iraq Vets Against the War, we're kind of taking it on, and I haven't checked back with them, but it's really in my mind. It came to mind, how nicely the military did perform. I said, oh no, when the tsunami happened. And Indonesia, and and went over Sri Lanka and all. The U.S. military really played a very good role in that catastrophic condition using their warships. And so I did, that was before, but I thought back to that and how I think people in the military would really prefer that to having to kill people. Also, so I don't know. Maybe that's a dreamy thing, but I don't know if you've all thought about it, but I hope you will.
Well, absolutely. And we're both, Henry and I are members of Iraq Veterans Against the War, which now calls itself About Face to allow, the veterans of Afghanistan and other sundry wars in. But, that this is an important topic. I mean, we saw the HMS Comfort, the naval ship, go to New York City, with limited effect, but it's still kind of a symbolic move. And I do think that there's aspects of the military that are efficient and effective and could be better purposed. And I think this is a key thing because, as you point out, it's hard to imagine spending more money for less output than we have post 9/11, fighting these brush fires that we largely create. But the reality is that climate crisis and pandemic and everything associated with it, refugees, these are the existential threats moving forward. And no amount of aircraft carriers, as I said on the radio in DC this morning, counting our aircraft carriers is not necessarily going to solve that. You can't count dollars spent on defense for outputs on protecting us from the real threat, right? Which is a global collective threat. So we're thinking about it. I'm going to write more about it. And I'm so glad you brought it up. But well, Roxanne, thanks so much. We'll close out here, and I hope we can do this again because I feel like there's a million directions you can go in. And when you complete or are near complete, or the book comes out for publication, your next work, then we're definitely going to do another episode if you're willing.
Great, thank you, Danny. Thank all of you, and it was really great talking to you.
Thanks, Roxanne.
Great. Talk to you soon. Bye.
Take care.
We're on Twitter at Fortress on a Hill, and also at Facebook.com at Fortress on a Hill. You can find our main blog page and our full collection of episodes at www.fortressonahill.com. iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Patreon, Spotify. You name it, almost anywhere you listen, we're already waiting for you. And hey, we're always in the market for more Patreon supporters. Please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com. And if you're not into giving us a monthly payment, think about giving us a couple bucks on PayPal. The link is in the show notes. Skepticism is one's best armor. Never forget it. We'll see you next time.
And listen to my song. I hope you'll pay attention. I will not